The process of lobbying involves identifying what the problem is, kind of figuring out if there's a federal solution for that problem, figuring out what lever to pull to make that change. Is it legislation? Is it regulation? Is it something else entirely? There is an idea out there, a misconception, that all lobbying is corrupt by its nature. I see lobbying as a neutral. I see it can be used for things that I don't believe in and that you don't believe in, and things that I do.
So in this episode, we're going to talk about what Americans get wrong about lobbyists, as well as more generally, what to know about this tremendously powerful force in American politics. And so today, I'm joined by Laura Kroger.
Hi, I'm Laura Kroger. I work for a U.S. Senator, I work for a U.S. agency, and then I worked as a registered lobbyist. So I've both lobbied and I have been lobbied.
Amazing. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about all things lobby related. As I said, it's something that I know a little bit about, but I've really never talked to anyone at depth about why lobbyists are important, what they do, but they come up all the time when I'd say people are casually discussing American politics and they say, oh, there are these lobbyists out there and they're like this unseen force that's just getting things done. And there's often sometimes I'll say it, a little bit of like a negative connotation of, you imagine people who work for like big tobacco and whatnot trying to get things done. But I'm sure there's so much more to it than that. So I'd really love to kind of demystify some of this and talk to you about, the work that you've done and your perspective on how does this entire, I guess, sub-industry almost operate in American political life. So first question is, for those who don't know, what is a lobbyist?
So a lobbyist is basically just a paid advocate. And advocacy is the larger umbrella, and that can encompass so many different things, right? Grassroots advocacy organization at the local level. It can include advertising and marketing. But the lobbyist itself is really just an organizational method, right? So if you have a cause that you feel very strongly about, you can get together with a lot of other people and you can pay a lobbyist to be the person on the ground all the time in Washington, D.C. and advocating for that particular cause. It's also enshrined by the Constitution. In the First Amendment, the protection of the right of the people to petition their own government for redresses. That is what lobbying is. It's advocacy in general, and then lobbyists are just the paid version of that.
Got it. Okay. So essentially it would be, I have a cause, I want the government to get I want to get their attention, but I'm just some random private citizen, so I can't very well go to Congress and knock on the front door and say, hey, people in Congress, I want you to talk about this thing. So I would hire a person, and that person then goes on the behalf of me and likely a very large group of us who have gotten together, and they petition or they lobby people in the U.S. government saying, hey, there's this cause that this group of people really cares about.
Yeah, I mean, and this can be a private entity, this could be a nonprofit, all sorts of causes, things that you agree with, things that you don't, all have lobbyists. It's kind of like when a jury selects a foreman, right? So if you go on a jury and you all make a decision together, it doesn't make sense for all 12 of you to go out into the courtroom and say, we think he's guilty, not guilty. You kind of appoint a spokesperson for that. And a lot of people who care about causes like yourself, like myself, we might have day jobs and may not live in Washington, D.C. And so this is just kind of a person on the ground who can get your point across. And that is the basic summary of what a lobbyist is. And obviously it's used in different ways depending on if you're a large corporate entity or like a very small organization. We can kind of get into that later.
So the point of it is to get your point across for any cause or any thing that you feel the U.S. government needs to be sort of aware of. Totally random side question. If you are not aware of this, that's totally fine. Are there lobbyists in other countries? Because I only ever hear it in American context, but I don't actually know anything about it internationally.
Yeah. So the term lobbying was first used, or lobbyist was first used in 1640s in Britain. And it referred to the lobbies of Parliament. So people would gather in these lobbies where people would come off of the floor of Parliament and they would try to make their case for their issue, right? So it predates our country, even. I am not an expert on how other people's political systems work or what their laws regarding lobbying are. Here in the US, there are quite a few laws that do govern it. So things about registration, you have to be very transparent about who you're lobbying, what about who your clients are, what you're paying, that sort of thing.
Okay. But they do, census, they do exist. And I mean, that would make sense that it comes from sort of that kind of English common law system. So, yes. And what, I guess, broad question, but like the net effect that lobbies have on the American political system, because we do hear about them a lot, so they're clearly important, but like what general effects, if you didn't have lobbies, what might be happening?
So I can kind of talk about this from my perspective, right? Like when I was a lobbyist, I kind of saw myself as an information broker. So my job, and I mostly represented city governments, county governments, nonprofits, that sort of thing. My job was to kind of translate for my clients who might come from a different world what their needs were into kind of the federal government perspective, and then vice versa, also to kind of communicate that backwards. And I use that because I used to work in the government, and that was just something that I learned a lot about in that process. So the process of lobbying involves identifying what the problem is, figuring out if there's a federal solution for that problem, figuring out what lever to pull to make that change. Is it legislation? Is it a regulation? Is it something else entirely? Who is the person who can, or people who can pull that lever, and then trying to convince that person of our perspective. And I think a lot of people from the outside, totally understandable, think it's just that last part of convincing people what to do. And a lot of it involves relationship building, right? So like in Hollywood or a lot of different industries, people want to work with people they find trustworthy or intelligent or have good instincts. And so when you are hired as a lobbyist, that is part of it. You want to make sure that you have a good working relationship with people who are working in the government. So when you ask, like, what would happen if we didn't have lobbyists? I think it's sort of just more of an organizational tool. You would absolutely have every right. So if you're in favor of a particular cause, let's just say you love the desert and you think that there should be a desert preservation, more desert preservation, more desert land should be preserved. You have every right to talk to your elected official about how much you care about that issue. But is the person from Texas going to take your call if you don't live in Texas, right? And that is kind of where a lobbyist comes in. If they have those relationships and can talk to Texas as well as California representatives, then they're a little bit more efficient and can expand your reach in terms of getting your point across for your cause.
Yeah, okay. And I would imagine there's also that sort of that jury foreman idea of, if you didn't have lobbyists, you just have all of these individual private citizens very sort of atomistically existing and just not really getting much done in terms of the energy they were pushing forward to, accomplish some kind of a cause, versus pooling resources and saying this is a larger entity that can now get things done.
Right. And I think that there's absolutely a role for that where it is even more influential. Like if you go to your city council meeting, there might be an opportunity for you to go forward and kind of give your perspective on things. The bigger the entity gets, like as when you get to the state and the national level, it just becomes a little bit more difficult to get through the noise. And so that is sort of what lobbying in general is organized to do, and why it has kind of come out of the current system that we have.
Okay. So I'm curious to hear more about the work that you did specifically, and if we can maybe use this as a case study of, here's kind of what I did when I was a lobbyist, and we can apply that framework to other types of lobbies, right? Because there are a lot of different types of lobbies. But so if you could tell me a little bit about the actual job that you did, the work that was part of your life as a lobbyist, and the firm that you were sort of working for, like what the actual steps of your job looked like. I mean, we don't need to go through like my daily life, but at a broad level, what was the work that you kind of were doing? What were the kind of interactions that you'd have with people? I always think of consultants, right? I've got to spend 4 days a week at some location, and three days a week I go home. And all of that kind of stuff. What was the dynamic on the ground like?
Sure. So the firm I worked for represented clients who were city governments, county governments, nonprofits primarily. And so a lot of the work that I did was with mayors, council members, county supervisors, city managers. So I was kind of in a unique position where I was helping government talk to government, right? Which should be more on the same page, but sometimes just comes from like wildly different worlds. So my job was to represent their interests at the federal level. A large part of those interests did come down to money. So the federal government controls a lot of the budget, and that money sometimes goes to states and then goes down to cities. Sometimes it goes directly to cities. So we're talking about like road projects, bridges, kind of public good projects. And then sometimes my work would be a little bit more esoteric. So let's say that the government has a grant program and they are going to fund roads and they want applicants that are cities that have more than 1 million people in them. This is a made up example, but it's pretty in line with what we would do. Let's say that you have a city that doesn't have 1 million people, but they have to maintain this road that is used by more than 1 million people. Let's say it connects like 2 major residential areas, and that just gets so much stuff. But because they're a smaller city themselves, because the population is smaller, they may not get as much funding as like the big things, even though they have to maintain this road. So if that's an issue, or if the grant program isn't clear, that might be something that we lobby on. Say, hey, city of whatever, city of XYZ is disadvantaged for this pool of money, or are we misinterpreting the intent of this program, or can we revise this program to make sure that they have the opportunity to get this money? And sometimes it would come down to smaller details, kind of like that. But by and large, most of it was, what information do we have that would make it easier for elected officials to do their job and have them be more informed? And then also vice versa, what information can I tell them about the federal government that can make it easier for them to run a city or run a county?
So in some cases, and some of these are going to sound like dumb questions, but I'm also kind of a dumb guy when it comes to lobbying, so that's why we're doing this. Was some of what you were lobbying for essentially like funding allocation, where it would just be a case of like, hey, give us more money for this city? Or what would the asks be, right? Because let's say there might just be a city and they need money to run things, or they've got problems there and stuff. What would they sort of be asking you? Hey, can you go to the federal government and talk to some people in Congress about, these set of problems that we have as the town of, whatever, Rock Ridge?
Sure. Yeah, it was definitely like that. And I think you kind of touched on a much more complicated and developing issue that has to do with earmarks. So there was a large swath of time in Congress where earmarks were not accepted, probably for the last 10, 15 years. And then there was a time when they came back. And what an earmark is, very briefly, because this is kind of like a whole can of worms, is the ability to put in legislative language, this particular project or city or whatever gets this money. So this road that connects these two systems will get $2 million directly from the federal government. For a long time, earmarks were not allowed. And the money was still there for those purposes, but they offloaded the decision-making power to the departments and sometimes the administration. So when I say administration, I mean like the presidential administration.
Yeah, right.
So like Joe Biden, Donald Trump. And the departments, which are sometimes political and sometimes not, right? So all of those departments, Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, would administer grant programs for that amount of funding, and decide based on a certain set of parameters who gets that funding. So basically, what has changed in that time frame is the decider, whether Congress itself is deciding who's getting that money or the departments are deciding who gets that money. So often, yes, it was about money either directly, like we need money for this, let's find a grant program, let's find an earmark when that was allowed. Or it would be, this grant program isn't working for us. Can we create a new grant program? Can Congress loosen the reporting requirements of this one so we don't have to pay so much staff? Or vice versa, maybe there can be more reporting requirements. It would really vary by the city, by the project, by their individual needs. I don't mean to be vague. It's more like it just could encompass so much under that umbrella.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And you said that something has changed now. So this idea of earmarks means that is now on the table as something that lobbyists can ask for.
I cannot speak authoritatively on
Totally
them this year because I am no longer a registered lobbyist.
Not a problem.
So that is no longer my strength. But yes, as of 3 years ago, they did bring them back in a limited capacity as a way of well, there's a larger argument about what this was. When they went away, it was considered corrupt. Like, people would just try to get things for their districts. But what the overarching effect was, and this is a little inside baseball, is people stopped talking to each other as much. So if they were trying to work on, so if you are working on an earmark for your district, let's say you are a congressman and you have a road project. I'm just going to stick with roads. So you have a road project in your district that needs, $300,000 or something. There is not really an incentive for anybody else in Congress to make sure that that road gets built and that has that $300,000. But you need to talk to other people in order to convince them that it's an important thing for your district. And then all of a sudden, now that you're talking to somebody across the aisle, maybe you're talking about another issue, and maybe you're finding ways to collaborate on that. So they brought it back in a limited capacity to see if, across the aisle dialogue could come back a little bit more in supporting each other's projects that are very essential, but we're getting kind of shunted to a more bureaucratic decision-making process in the departments, if that makes sense.
Okay. A little bit. And I guess, yeah, a little bit. I'm trying to use sort of, this is weird, but like the Hollywood analogy I have, which is like producing, like what does a producer do? And it seemed like I'm trying to draw some thematic through lines about this notion of, well, your job's to put people together and get solutions. And
what I went into with earmarks is like grad school level, like lobbying and stuff. So it's a little bit less, it's pretty in the weeds, but yeah, a metaphor with producer. Tell me a little bit more about that thought.
So what it seems to be is that the metaphor that I have for what a lobbyist does, if we translate it to Hollywood, right, is what a producer does. At least there are a lot of different types of producers, but in theory what they do is they go around and they pick up little pieces of value for the purpose of making a movie, like a script, an actor, a director, and they get everyone together to say, you're going to be a team now and you're going to work on things, and I'm also going to make sure that we have all the legal rights to do what we're going to do. And then I also get people who have the money and I bring them in. And so my job is bringing people and things together so that a movie can happen. And when you were starting, there was a little bit of that idea of like, well, my idea is if you want to get the government to help out with deserts, right, but you just live in Utah, you can't get someone from Texas to also be on your team. You need a person to like put all those people together. That was the only reason I thought producing.
That's, actually, I think you're sort of onto something, but I would phrase it a little bit differently. So I think that the best analogy for producers in government is probably more of a, not one particular person or role, but like the concept of coalition building. Like, there's always a lot of organizations. So if you run this kind of desert preservation, you might have a lot in common with the rainforest preservation organization, and maybe you want to join forces on like a lands bill, right? And so that like all together will come together. The closest analogy I've always thought to Hollywood for lobbying was managers and agents. So they're kind of the ones who are, while the screenwriter or whoever is off doing their thing, the nitty gritty of either the writing or the policy work or the day-to-day running, then that manager can go off and be an advocate for their client to the industry where they have a lot of relationships. You can change your manager out the way you can change a lobbyist out. That has a lot of overlap, I think, with what they do.
What are people in your daily life? I have my sort of stereotypical misconceptions that I can go into as just a regular layman, but in your daily life, like the misconceptions that people have about what lobbying is or what they do.
Yeah. So I think you kind of touched on it a little bit before, right? Like there is an idea out there, a misconception that all lobbying is corrupt by its nature. And to say that is like saying all lawyers are corrupt or all politicians are corrupt. Like nobody is immune. No industry or profession is immune from corruption, but to dismiss it entirely is to overlook the opportunities for positive change, right? Like it's just an organizational tool that you can use for things that you like as well as things that you don't like. And most of what people are talking about when they talk about corruption is money in lobbying. And I'm kind of going like 50,000 foot level and I'm breaking it down as I go. But when we talk about money in lobbying, we're talking about two main different things. One is expenditures. So when we talk about so-and-so, what this company spent, $100 million on lobbying, mostly what they're talking about is salaries. So they're talking about people at the federal level, people at all the individual state levels to lobby state governments, state legislatures. That can add up. So that's expenditures on lobbying. And then we're also talking about campaign donations. And this is where it gets kind of icky, right?
That's the one I think that people often,
yes.
when they think like, oh, all of it's corrupt,
right.
That's the stuff that they're thinking about.
Right. So first of all, there's a lot of laws governing that. So as a registered lobbyist, I had to register with the government, report what I was lobbying on, report what I was, who my clients were, all of that stuff. So everybody knew who I was. That's like public information. You can look that up for all sorts of lobbying firms, in-house lobbyists, that sort of thing. The campaign donations are supposed to be separate. They're supposed to be over here. So if I worked for Corporation A, my job as a lobbyist is to do everything that I just described to you. And then separately, they're also donating or not donating to campaigns as they see fit. I am not supposed to, nor I would never put somebody in this position, but it is technically on the politicians and staff to adhere to the Hatch Act, which prevents people from talking about campaign anything on government property during government time. You can't talk about campaign finance. You can't talk about campaigning at all. So that is never something as a lobbyist I would talk about.
What is the Hatch Act?
Yeah, it is a overarching law that governs the ethics of federal employees and whether or not they can participate or talk about campaigns in their official capacity as government employees. So that's both politicians and staff. So if you are a congressman, you cannot go into a meeting with a lobbyist, with an entity, with anybody, with a constituent, and talk about the campaign if you are on government time in government buildings, right? That has to be like a totally separate thing. And lobbyists know that. They're not held to that exact standard, but they know that the people they're talking to are. So what loosened this up is Citizens United, which is a Supreme Court case that you may have heard of and your viewers may have
I've heard of Citizens United. Do you mind reminding me?
Of course, yeah. So
what it was.
In a previous court case, the Supreme Court did agree that money is covered under the First Amendment as free speech. Like where you spend your money counts as free speech. Citizens United opened that up and said, companies, corporations, these large entities are entitled to free speech the way that humans are, like individuals. And so that became, and they removed. Was
this the one where they said corporations are people?
Yeah.
Was that the citizen?
Yeah, that is kind of how it gets summarized for sure.
Yeah.
So the effect of this, and they also took a cap off of it for companies. So you and I as individuals have a dollar amount cap we can give to each politician. I think it's something like $3,500. And that's not necessarily the case, especially if you're giving to PACs. Which are political action committees, which are kind of exist outside of participating in, but not exactly the politician. Anyway, that is not my area of expertise, I will admit. So we have reached the extent of my knowledge on that. But what it does is muddy the waters. So you are not allowed to announce or say quid pro quo if you pass this bill for me, politician, I will give you money. But because Citizens United exists, the implication is there. Like, you don't need to announce it in order for someone to wonder, if I don't pass this bill, will they give me the money that I need for my campaign, right? And that is really a campaign finance law issue and less of a lobbyist specific issue. And we could talk about like what it would take to change that. And they're not entirely separate, but for the purpose of like explaining what a lobbyist might do on a day-to-day basis, I wanted to kind of make that distinction.
So, and actually that was sort of my next question about the negative aspects of lobbyists that maybe do play in a little bit to the stereotype is kind of that notion of like, we're not officially going to give you money, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, but like, we all kind of know that we're going to give you money if you do the thing that we want, but like, we're legally not going to say that openly. Seems to be one of like the negative stereotypes that does exist to a certain degree.
Sure. Yeah. And that is harder to regulate, right? And we have a lot of laws that have gone away with certain Supreme Court cases that have made that a little bit easier. So yeah, I can't fight you on that one. It's definitely not the case for all lobbyists. Like, we kind of talked about all the different types of lobbyists and who they lobby for and stuff. But especially for the larger entities, the larger corporations, you're going to see that. And that's pretty transparent too. So if you go to like opensecrets.org, you can see both what everybody spends on lobbying and who they donate to and how much. Okay.
And then in terms of maybe the not negative stereotype, but going back to sort of a misconception, like a positive aspect of this, actually, that you don't think maybe gets enough airtime, that when you talk to someone and you say, I'm a lobbyist, and they go, oh, you're like, no, but actually we do good things like this. Like,
sure. I think that I don't necessarily lump lobbyists in with other lobbyists. I lump them in with the causes that they advocate for, if that makes sense. So when I think about lobbyists as a whole, I'm not sitting here arm in arm with oil companies saying like, we are the same. I'm talking about my issues that I work for, right? I see lobbying as a neutral. I see it can be used for things that I don't believe in and that you don't believe in, and things that I do. So when we talk about like positive things coming out of lobbying, absolutely. I'm a big fan of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That had a huge grassroots advocacy effort, and there were also hired lobbyists in there to make sure that got across the finish line. We have things like minimum wage. There's cannabis legalization at the state level. Like, there were lobbyists working on those issues in COVID when we had these large COVID aid packages coming out, like right after it hit the US for the first time. We were able to advocate for things, or lobbyists, I should say, in general, were able to advocate for things like telehealth and child tax credit expansions that helped people a lot. So I would say that there are so many cogs working in the political machine, from the constituents, like the grassroots efforts, to politicians, that everything that's good probably had a lobbyist behind it or participating, and everything that's bad probably had a lobbyist participating.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. The idea of you don't associate with other lobbyists, you associate with the cause that you're a part of. And that, to me, is like, I'm going to try to start thinking about it that way. That it's like, that's just a front person for whatever that organization wants to get done. The lobbyists themselves aren't in some sort of cabal with each other where they just do like lobby things. It's more like, well, who do you work for? Like, right, as you said, like, it would be like a lawyer or something. It's like, well,
yeah. And to clarify, like, that is my personal association. Like, that's how I think about it. There are lobbying industry groups. There are, mixers where people kind of compare notes, but I will say, like, the oil companies don't want to talk to me. Like, I'm not.
And I think that can be a takeaway. That could be
Yeah.
that could be a big takeaway. Speaking of the oil companies, actually, I'm curious your sense of the very powerful lobbies, the ones that I think of like big tobacco and the oil lobby and pharmaceuticals. But in your experience, like what are the really big names out there that have a tremendous amount of influence in?
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways to answer this question. Um, and I think you could look at it as people who spend a lot on lobbying, like the efforts of lobbying. And if you're looking at that, it's the US Chamber of Commerce. I mean, by far, like by orders of magnitude more than other folks. Yeah.
So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, this like have no idea about this. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right? That's a government entity.
No, it's an organization of businesses. So it's like an industry group.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? So I'm realizing about my own ignorance here. What is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Let's just start from square one.
So I am not an expert. My understanding is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is not something that I worked with a whole lot in my capacity, is an industry group of that represents business and general business interests at the federal level and also at the state and local level. So like your city might have a chamber of commerce and they're sort of they might organize businesses in your city or in your neighborhood around a common cause. So I am not super well versed on
That's
the
okay.
jurisdictional issues there, but it is a non-governmental entity. Yes.
I see.
Yeah.
And so that is the largest lobbying group in
That is the biggest spending.
biggest spending. Okay.
On lobbying, and there is a difference. So there's that. There's also the biggest, and then you'll also see like pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, tech companies. This is all OpenSecrets.com. These are numbers. The biggest donors, meaning political donors, campaign donations, those are going to come from corporations, manufacturers. You'll kind of see those listed out as well. But I think what you're asking is sort of unanswerable. You're asking like who's the most effective, and that is like not measurable. It's so ephemeral and subjective and hard to say because there are so many people in the process, and they'll all say they're really effective, right? Like that is they're defending their job. They're saying like, look what I did. But no politician is ever going to say I did that because Laura Kroger came and talked to me and changed my mind, right? So
Makes sense. Okay. Speaking about reform, you mentioned like you could have a long discussion about this issue of okay, because earmarks have now been put into play, and it makes things. There's now this whole thing of like lobbyists are going out there and literally just saying we want more money for this thing. What would lobbying reform, totally in your perspective, in your mind, kind of consist of, and like what do you think should be done, regardless of whether or not it's actually possible, and also what problems we could clear up if we got rid of this roadblock, like what were the problems that you just saw as a lobbyist, and how could reform sort of make it better?
well, I have three like public facing ideas, and then I have one that I think is really important that isn't very sexy. So we talked about campaign finance a little bit. Campaign finance reform is possible. It's tough though. Like it probably would take a constitutional amendment. And that's a really difficult process. Congress has to pass it. And then I think it's something like 3/4 or 4/5 of the state legislatures have to ratify it. Big process. To get that done, it would require a lot of organization across the country. And then the organization would probably be so big, you'd probably have to hire lobbyists. So like it sort of feeds into it, right? Constitutional amendment, but like don't lose hope. Like that is possible. Transparency in general is always good. There's a lot of laws on the books and a lot of stuff that's very public. It's not always the most accessible, but there are government websites where you can look up lobbyists, lobbying spending, registrations, all that sort of thing. So you as a citizen can kind of keep an eye on that. We as a country could probably be a little bit tougher with Hatch Act violations. It sort of depends on who is in power and how much people are being held to account on Hatch Act violations, which is kind of talking about campaign finance stuff while on the job. But my biggest one of the biggest things I think can be done is going to sound controversial. And the answer to that is pay congressional staff more, like increase the budget for Congress. And this sounds bad. Like when I say this out loud, people are like, this sounds like a terrible idea. Basically because Congress isn't very popular. But the first thing that Congress can do in an election year, or maybe if they first take power, a new party takes power, is they freeze their budgets or they cut their budgets as a signal to their electorate saying, hey, look, we're not spending tons of money on ourselves. We're going to cut our own budgets. Like that's how much we are responsible with the federal budget. But this has an effect when all of these staff positions, and any member of Congress can have between probably 7 and 50 members of staff, depending on where they're from and what chamber, right? When you pay staff less, people will leave. Like that's the quickest way to say it, right? Is you have a low income and people want to do the right thing. They like to work for government. They like to work in public service. But at a certain point, if you can't support a family on that income or, raise a family because the hours are too long, then you're going to leave. And what that ends up happening, what that ends up causing is that there's just a ton of congressional staffers that are all in their like early to mid 20s. And they are overwhelmed. They're just not subject matter experts yet. They're very smart. They're super smart people. But they're drinking from a fire hose all the time. So what that ends up resulting in is they're more likely to, if somebody can make their job easier, they will probably take them up on it, right? So if you are 22 years old and you're thrown into this and you don't know what you're doing, and a lobbyist comes up and says, oh, I have this like bill. I just wrote all the bill text for you. Like, don't worry about it. Like, if you just want to pass this, your boss will think you're super smart. They might be vulnerable to that. It's like, oh, gee, thanks. Like now I don't have to spend hours and hours doing this. I can work on all my other work. But that might be a little bit biased towards that industry, right? Because they're the ones who wrote it, the lobbyists or their organization writ large. The other thing is that it prevents, when you have salaries at such a low level, the only people who can get into Congress to work for Congress are either people who can survive on that low of a dollar amount, which is usually like roommates and stuff, or people who are supported by their parents. And so then you have a lack of an entry point for anybody who didn't grow up with some level of means. And that skews the kind of laws that we make, right? So if everybody's perspective or a majority perspective in Congress is folks who are kind of in the top like 10% of income levels in Congress, that doesn't bode well for how equitable our laws are. So there's a lot of impacts of that. We see it constantly. It's really well known in Washington, D.C., and I don't know how much it's talked about outside of D.C., but the idea that there will be a point at which you cannot work on the Hill anymore if you want to have either work-life balance or like money to support a family, and then you will leave. And that can feed into like larger revolving door issues that people have problems with. But by and large, more funds for congressional staff would mean people would stick around longer. They would get older. They would be more subject matter experts and rely less on outside sources for information. And honestly, like their bullshit meter would be better. Like if you're 35 and somebody comes in with like a cockamamie plan, you're probably going to pick up on that a little bit better than if you're 22. And it's no shade to 22-year-olds. It's just the amount of life you've lived in that amount of time, right? So that is my personal soapbox that I think could be a really small, relative to the whole federal budget, really small change that could have really big impacts.
I mean, going back to Hollywood sounds like an assistance, and sort of there's a whole thing there of like, assistants don't get paid enough, and we have the same problem. So, I'm always in favor of paying people a livable wage, especially if they're working a fairly taxing job. Yeah. So, absolutely. You had said the term revolving door. Now, I've heard that term before. What does that mean when we talk about a revolving door in politics or whatnot?
Yeah, so a revolving door is the idea that you may leave government and go work for a private industry, which may or may not be lobbying, but sometimes is. And then perhaps you will go back and work for government after. And that in and of itself is not a major problem. The two, it makes sense because they're in the same industry. You have a lot of the same relationships. Sometimes people are hired for their relationships. The main issues are twofold, and they kind of overlap with some of the stuff we've talked about before. One is there is a concern about bribery. So if you work for a private entity and you go into government and you plan to go work for the private entity again, and they're paying you for that, then there is kind of an implication of like, you're a spy in government. You're going to go and do stuff for us, and then you're going to come back and we'll pay you a lot of money. There's laws to counter this. Like, we know about this. There's cooling off periods for lobbyists where they can't lobby the federal government after they've been working for it. There's stuff that you can do on that one. And the other one is a little bit more amorphous. It's like the concept of loyalty. Like, if you used to work for a tobacco company, could you fairly regulate tobacco for the government? And that is hard to pass a law about specifically. But we also have checks and balances to counter that, right? So there's a lot of people working on policies to make sure that no one person has any sort of influence. And then I talked a little bit about Congress and like paying congressional staffers more to make it less attractive to go to private industry. It happens a lot in terms of government to lobbying, or government to private industry, I should say. The other thing that causes it to happen is administration change. So the president. So you may work for the government under a particular president. Let's say you work under a Democrat, and you do that for 4 years, and you live it, and you regulate, I don't know, trains. You regulate trains. And then a Republican president comes into power, and your job is one that is tied to who is in power. So you're no longer working in that position. You need a job. So you might go work for like a train company. 4 years later, there's another Democrat in power. You really liked that job. You didn't want to have to leave that job. Now do you go back and work regulating trains again? And so it could be a totally benign reason, but then that creates like a question about where your loyalties lie. That is not I don't think there's any sort of like malicious force causing this to happen. It's more like this industry has shook out this way, and now we have to deal with the consequences of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of sort of like malicious forces versus just natural human opportunism does seem to be kind of a big thing here, where it's like, well, humans are gonna do what they want to do to get ahead and like get this objective done. And if you have enough people doing that in a big center of power, eventually people are going to figure out certain kind of loopholes and workarounds and all of these things that then result in, negative outcomes.
There's that. There's also, when there's a system that doesn't have one particular, the buck stops with this person, or this person is to blame, then it's a lot easier to say like, well, the whole company chose this, or the whole firm chose this. So it isn't, I'm speaking like broadly. I do think that there are like bad actors out there for sure who will take advantage of the system. But so much of the time it's like larger sociological forces or institutional forces that have pushed us for a particular like set of events to occur. And this is what I would tell my clients all the time if they were concerned about, why didn't this person call us back? Is this like a secret message? They're mad at us about this thing. I would say it's probably something really dumb. Like, more often than not, it's someone was on vacation and lost the email, or had a bad day at work and just didn't get back to us in time. So I don't want to say that that bad actors don't exist, but I'm also aware that the simplest explanation is usually the right one.
Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. I do try to keep
that context. Yeah. When I'm looking at
the institutional one's also fascinating. The idea that as institutions exist for longer and longer periods of time, and there's sort of like I almost think of it like a foundation, the way buildings are, built on top of each other over eras of history. And there's just like, if you're on this giant pile of institutional stuff, you're going to be behaving in a different way versus if you had just started from day one and like, there is no institution. We're just going to build it up from the ground.
For sure. And I think that's my perspective is one that does not easily lend itself to a clear good versus evil thing to get angry at, but it is also something we can change. Like institutions were built by people and they can be rebuilt by people. If there's a problem in how our systems are working, then we can change those systems.
Yeah. So my next section here, and this is totally if you want to run with this, if not, well, no worries, we can move on, is without getting super political. So, here's my view on the world and my political allegiance, but to discuss political parties and how this factors into lobbying. I don't know if that's something you want to touch on, if you feel comfortable touching on, but what I'm curious to hear about is from just as a neutral observer, if you found that there were certain directions that a lot of Democrats versus Republicans went in when it came to what kinds of companies are they surrounding themselves with, or what kinds of what kinds of lobbyists tend to talk more to Democrats or more to Republicans, or the couple of independents out there, and were there any interesting just patterns that you saw?
Sure. And the stuff that, my observations are not particularly secret. I think a lot of these are public knowledge. Some wouldn't surprise you, I think that Planned Parenthood advocates for causes that Democrats support, right? They mostly lobby Democrats because, I think there's a sunk cost. Well, that's not the phrase. There's why would you spend the time on somebody who's not going to agree with you type of idea? And they probably also donate, and they do also donate majority or exclusively to Democrats. Flip side, NRA. So the National Rifle
Guns
Association
is going to be Republicans, yeah.
Right. They're probably going to talk mostly to Republicans, and they're probably going to donate mostly to Republicans. And then there's a lot of other organizations that are pretty split. So things like Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, people in the financial industry, you're going to see them give to both parties and advocate to both parties, lobby to both parties. I think that those are kind of the bigger obvious things. The more into the weeds you get on issues, the less political it gets. And that was my favorite stuff too. So going with the desert lands preservation example, right? So you and me, you've hired me, I'm going to be your lobbyist. We're going to work together. We're going to get this across the finish line. And there's a swath of land that we want to make sure is preserved in the desert. We think it's really cool. We may not, we can talk to the person who represents that land. They're probably going to, maybe they'll agree with us. They're like, great, we want to preserve this. But the person who represents the district nearby may not care as much until we make the case that, hey, there's a lot of people in your district who are employed in tourism. And the more tourism dollars go into this neighboring district in the desert, the more you, congressman, are going to have a better economic system in your district. And that isn't super Democrat or Republican, right? That is something that our political representatives should be thinking about, of how am I going to represent my district or my state to the best of my ability. And that is the kind of argument that we might make, and they wouldn't know if you're a Republican or a Democrat in that situation, and they don't care if I am either. If we're talking about something on the nitty-gritty kind of smaller detail level like that, if that makes sense. But I will say that there are lobbyists who if you worked on the Hill, Capitol Hill as a Democrat, all of your relationships might be Democrats. You might be hired by a firm to only lobby Democrats. So it can split that way, but it is not part of how you register or what kind of work that you might do if your firm doesn't organize in that fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that makes sense, that there's sort of the really hot button culture war topics where it splits the way you think it does, but when you get down to just the administration of running a large town, it kind of, nobody really cares. It's just we have these things and we'd like to have them addressed, and we don't really care if you're a Democrat or Republican. Just get it done. Yeah. So I'm curious, with a little bit more time, I'm curious to actually talk a little bit about, if you want, a little bit of the history of lobbying, or kind of how did this stuff evolve? Because my understanding is that's something you have a little bit of a kind of a background in. Because I love history. I don't know anything about the history of lobbying, or how did it just like take form or anything like that?
So I may know less than you think. So I mentioned a little bit before about it. It predates our country, which is true. We have had issues with how we regulate lobbying for as long as we've been a country, especially in like the mid 1800s. We were passing laws to kind of limit bribery when a quid pro quo was a little bit more overt. I will give you this gift and you will of money and you will pass my bill. We have laws that have happened. I couldn't tell you when, but there are restrictions on gifts. So if I am a registered lobbyist and I go out to dinner or coffee with someone who works on Capitol Hill, I can only buy them something up to $5 or something. I think it might have been recently raised to $10, but it's pretty low. Like there are dollar amount limits on kind of casual type of gifts when you're interacting. There are also changes that have been made on behalf of, if you're lobbying on behalf of foreign governments. So in like the 30s through the 50s, kind of mid and then post World War II period, they started to be a little bit more aware of people who were getting paid by not the United States or other countries that were not the United States to lobby within the United States. So we have restrictions on that. Disclosures, those kind of came along not so long after. And then if you know a
Disclosures,
lobbyist,
like in terms of you have to publicly say, hey, we're lobbyists and we do this, and
it is actually more literal than that. So when I was a registered lobbyist, every quarter, and it's different at every state level. So this is only, my knowledge is only the federal government. Every quarter I would have to submit documentation saying who all my clients are, what they're paying me, like literal dollar amounts, what I am lobbying on their behalf for, sometimes literal bills, sometimes like a concept or an issue area, and who I contacted. And I myself am registered, was registered. So you can go and look up who all is a lobbyist and who is not. That is all public information. And the idea of that is to make sure people know who they're talking to, who they're representing, and also to make it clear if somebody steps over the line in government, like be able to kind of draw the through lines there.
connect the dots and say, like, oh, that person was having meetings with and dealing with these lobbyists who were representing X interest.
Right. Yeah. If you think that you have a case for this person reliably protected desert lands, and then they met with this person on this day who represents fracking, and then they got a large donation to their campaign account on this day, and then the next day they voted against desert lands. You can kind of draw that through line. You can never know what's in somebody's head, but that is designed to be able to make that case, to kind of see if undue influence is had.
So then let's say that happens. Let's say you're lobbying this person to preserve the desert lands. They sign the fracking bill to say, let's just drill it all. What would happen? And then someone says, wait, let's look at the documentation. We connect the dots. This seems a little fishy. What would happen then? Like, what would the next stage be?
So this is where the press and elections come in. So there is, barring some sort of recording where you have somebody secretly recorded saying, I will give you this money and you will pass this bill, or vote against this bill rather, you're kind of just pointing to it, right? So if you have that recording, that's illegal. Like, you can prove that has happened. If you don't,
it's illegal to have a recording.
Oh, no. It's illegal to offer to do something in government.
Oh, yeah, to offer someone to say, I'll give you money if you sign this bill. Yeah.
It might also be illegal to record people without their consent. That varies by state. I do not know. But I'm sure that the media would not care. They would publish it, and then all of a sudden you have a story. And the idea of that is that you will be held accountable by the public, by your voters. So ideally, In a situation like that, the voters would not take kindly to that. But there's also corruption trials. So Senator Menendez resigned because he took a lot of money from foreign governments, and the implication, and didn't report it. And the implication of that is that he was doing something on behalf of those foreign governments in government, and that's a big no-no. So there are systems set up to hold him accountable within the structure of the US Senate, and there are also laws, like larger laws about bribery and fraud, that the Department of Justice and our justice system can kind of bring to bear, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. Well, we're almost out of time here, so I just want to see if there's any last point that, like, we haven't brought up that you'd like to just, lay on the table, sort of any just final kind of takeaways for a listener or a watcher of this episode. Like, here's just a basic thing you should know about lobbying when you hear the word in your daily life. It doesn't just mean, like, big tobacco giving money to Congress.
From a structural perspective, there's different ways. You can hire a firm. So I worked for a firm that had multiple clients that would pay us money to lobby. But you can also have in-house lobbyists. So if you are
for
the
a company, a company can have an in-house lobbyist.
An organization can too.
Or an organization, yeah.
Yeah, if you have the money, if you're the Desert Lands organization and you want to pay the salary of a lobbyist to live in DC and do the thing, they would only work for you. And so that is totally fine. There are restrictions on, the same restrictions as the firms in terms of like how much of their time they spend lobbying and the reporting and such, but like they can work for you only. It's kind of like lawyers in that way, right? So you can hire a firm that has a bunch of lawyers, or you can hire an in-house lawyer. You can have a lawyer that works just for your company or just for your organization on stuff. And it's also kind of like lawyers in the sense that when we talk about money in lobbying, it's kind of like money in hiring a lawyer. So there are lobbying by its structure, it's like moral neutral structure will never be able to perfectly represent the electorate in all of their views, right? Like if there is money to pay people to do the job, you will inevitably have people who have a lot of money and can hire a lot of lobbyists, the way you can hire a lot of lawyers if you have a big company, or you can hire better lawyers if you are a big company or a celebrity or something, right? And that's not fair, but it's also not something I understand how to fix without attacking larger issues with capitalism. So once we kind of start talking about that, that is where I find it difficult to figure out a solution. But from what I was doing in like city governments and stuff, I know that other people are spending all of this money, and I saw it as my goal to make sure that they had a little bit more of a voice at the table up against all of these people spending all of this money. So it is not a fair system because of many different factors, but there's a lot that we can do to make sure that as citizens of this country, like our voice is heard using lobbying and also up against other forces that are lobbying.
That's very helpful, and I think this has really given me a much better context of how to think about how to think about lobbyists, because going into this, I will say, like, I was like a lot of generic people about just associating it with kind of these negative stereotypes, and this has really helped me kind of couch it to see it in a very neutral way, the same way you'd see like someone who's a lawyer. Like, there are tons of people who are lawyers that do good stuff, and plenty of people who do bad stuff, and plenty of people who are just in the middle, and they're just doing what they need to do as what they've been hired to, the task to complete. And that the lobbying falls very much in a similar sort of thing. It's a part of American political life and the interchange of ideas between constituents and organizations and companies going to the federal government to talk to them.
And I think you're allowed to judge individual lobbyists by what they lobby on.
Oh, I mean, for sure. Yeah, no, like bad people, like we can 100% judge them. Yeah, for being bad people.
Right.
Like,
I'm not here to like defend lobbyists. I'm
sure.
Like, bad people are going to do bad people things, right? So it's Very possible, but of course, there's issues that I would never choose to lobby on, and I'm sure it's the same for other folks. So, yeah, by all means, like hold lobbyists accountable, but there's also like this larger system at play that places lobbyists in the middle of a lot of moving parts.
Thanks so much for coming on, Laura. It's been great to have you. This has been a great conversation. If people want to know where to find you or kind of learn more about the work that you're doing, what can they check out?
Yeah, you can go to my website. It's lauracroger.us. It's LAURAKROEGER.us. It's just like in the title of this video. And you can kind of see about some of the services that I offer there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you all if you made it this far in terms of watching, listening, what have you. And we will see you in the next episode. Take care.